Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvot havetzivanu l'suk b'divrei Torah. Baruch na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu k'fi b'cha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu v'tzetzenu v'tzetzem b'cha beit Yisrael kulam yodei shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma Baruch atah Adonai l'mei Torah l'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam asher b'chabanu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Just can I read the English? Blessed Lord Adonai, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Please, Adonai, God, sweeten the words of your Torah in our mouth and in the mouth of your people, the family of Israel. May we and our offspring and the offspring of your people, the house of Israel, all of us know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Blessed Lord Adonai, who teaches Torah to his people, Israel.
Amen.
Blessed Lord Adonai,
Amen.
God, King of the universe, who has selected us from all the peoples and gave us his Torah. Blessed Lord Adonai, giver of the Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, Schottenstein
Okay.
by Rabbi Mayerfeld.
No, I'm not. You guys are Rabbonim. I'm not. Okay. Anyway, let's go weiter. Damon. Okay, so part 10. You shall not wrong one another, and that comes from Vayikra. Verse forbids us to say anything that will insult or anger another person. And that's in Bava Kamma. Some example of this deeds: embarrassing someone for his family background, ridiculing someone for his lack of Torah knowledge, insulting someone for his lowly status, asking someone how he would answer a certain question when you know he's not competent to reply. And if you relate Lashon Hora to others in the presence of the victim, besides being guilty of speaking Lashon Hora, you also violate this prohibition. It says if you relate Lashon Hora to others in the maybe about him in his presence.
That's terribly embarrassing.
Yeah, that's the word.
Sure.
Just to avoid negative speech, and it's not easy, Damon. I mean, if something bad happens in business, maybe you want someone's advice. It's that's why you got to know these laws. That sometimes you can, you know.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think this last point that you made about embarrassing someone, I don't think there could be any worse crime than that, is to make somebody feel awkward or small or incompetent, especially saying it where they feel powerless, where you're embarrassing them to their face. That's horrific. Kevin, that's absolutely horrific. Where is that? Does it say where it is in Vayikra, or was it just general?
Vayikra chapter 23 verse 17. Actually, Bava Kamma 58b.
Okay, great.
What's
So
that about? Bava Kamma, what's that about?
About losing
Bava-
objects. Huh?
Yeah, acquisition of objects amongst other things.
Okay.
So I learned it with Rabbi Tuvia Sifris for a while, the late Rabbi Tuvia Sifris. Please God, we'll do it. It's the second set after Bava Kamma. Guys, I tell you where we ended off yesterday, very quickly, is that we realized that there's no dire limitation that seems to be applied to this particular Kol V'chomer. How do we know that? Is it doesn't reduce the it doesn't reduce the until evening setup of impurity for a mat, where you have to clean the mat and make sure until evening, you mikvah it, you clean it, and it seems to apply the 7 days for a human corpse when a mat is exposed to air contamination with the dead body in the same tent. So he's saying it's a problem because there's no diet that seems to be applied. If we said it was tum until evening, there would still be part of the Kol V'chomer applied, because what's the unknown quantity? We don't know what's the status of a mat if it's in the vicinity of a dead body in the tent. So we said at least if we came out with knowing that it's impure until evening, we've at least learned something, because before nothing was known. So therefore a dyer, even Rabbi Tarfon could say that the dyer, even if it would come to constrain, would still teach us something. Therefore he would even hold by dyer. So it seems that in this particular case, Rav Rav Achav Divti seems to say that the ton of this brisa, he said to Ravina, doesn't seem to subscribe to Dario at all. It is sufficient. So the Gemara answers, but okay, so Ravina actually replied to Rav Achav Divti, and he said, look, we learned there was a case of Rav Nechumai bar Zachariah, and he chatted to Abaya, and Abaya addressed this exact issue with him. And he said, this is actually how the brisa should read. He said he derives it, Abaya, from the susceptibility of a mat to corpse tumor, and he derives it from the law of sheretz through a different derivation. So this is how the amendment goes. It says, from where is it known to us that a mat contracts tumor in the case of contact with the sheretz? Okay. And how do we know this? There's in Vayikra Leviticus chapter 11, verse 29 to 30. And it says, I'm going to show you now, a person, utensil, or food that touches even a little bit of the sheretz's carcass becomes tameh, impure until evening. Okay? And it carries on until the 35th verse. So the Torah there states that utensils, which can contract tumah from a sheretz, includes any wooden vessel, a garment, leather, sackcloth, any earthenware vessel in which one of them should fall. In other words, a part of a sheretz. But even though a mat fits into none of these categories, how do we know that it can also contract tumah from sheretz? So let me just see if I can share my screen. Just give me a second, guys.
And you talk about sheretz, say dead animals. These are dead creatures.
Yeah, they did. That's correct, Kev. They're absolutely dead as a doornail. Let me just share my screen.
So also, I mean, these dead animals can't touch anything. So something has these pots and everything have to actually touch the sheretz. They have to land on it for some reason. So
James,
it's unlikely.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is I can't wear a crocodile belt and I can't wear a snake belt because that's tumor actually.
No, it's manufactured. Huh?
But
I honestly don't know how it works in the processing. I really have no idea.
Carcass as in the rotting carcass, or do they mean the like the skin of an animal, which is not rotten, it's been sterilized? Is that still? I mean, we need to find.
Well, it contains spiritual tumor, whatever that means. It doesn't have to be rotting.
Okay.
And in fact, we just recently learned in Sanhedrin that if a non-shechted animal comes in contact with the Jew, it's a type of sheretz. Do you remember, Gav? We learned this on Sunday.
Really? Wow.
So remember we learned the following shall be unclean for you from among the things that swarm on the earth, the mole, the mouse, the great lizards of every variety, the gecko, the land crocodile, the lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. So this is in Leviticus 30 and 31. These are for you the unclean among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be unclean until evening. Now this is where it goes on to being interesting. Arthur, I want you to read it now that your mic's working.
Okay. And anything on which one of these falls when dead shall be unclean, be it any article of wood, or a cloth, or a skin, or a sack. Any such article that can be put to use shall be dipped in water, and it shall remain unclean until evening. Then it shall be clean. Next one.
Okay, continue.
And if any of those fall into an earthen vessel, everything inside it shall be unclean, and the vessel itself you shall break.
Excellent. Continue.
As to any food that may be eaten, it shall become unclean if it came in contact with water. As to any liquid that may be drunk, it shall be unclean if it was inside any vessel. Everything on which the carcass of any of them falls shall be unclean. An oven or stove shall be smashed. They are unclean, and unclean they shall remain for you.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So basically, let's just carry on. is that what it wants to do is it wants to use a separate sort of way to solve it. First thing I'm going to tell you is I'm going to give you the, what do you call it? I'm going to give you the Kol V'chomer and then show you how the Gezerah Shava is amended from that. So it says, it's known to us that a mat contracts tumah in the case of contact with the sheretz. It's a logical derivation, the Kol V'chomer. If small earthenware vials, which are pure in the case of a zav, become impure in the case of contact with the sheretz, then is it not logically compelling that a mat, which becomes impure in the case of a zav, becomes impure in the contact with the sheretz? Does that make sense so far, guys?
Yeah.
Have you got it, or do you want me to read it again slowly, Kev?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you want me to read it again?
Yeah, read it again. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Just one second. Yeah, thanks.
The Brisa says, from where is it known that a mat contracts tumah in the case of contact with a sheretz? It's a logical derivation of Kol V'chomer. If small earthenware vials, which are pure in the case of a zav, become impure in the contact with a sheretz, is it not logically compelling that a mat, which becomes impure in the case of a zav, becomes tama in the case of contact with a sheretz? So what it's saying is, if a mat is a zav is generally much more chilled when it comes to earthenware containers because he can't stick his fingers or any body part within the small opening of the earthenware containers or vials. So then obviously that container remains pure. But a sheretz has to drop something the size of a lentil piece and then it becomes impure and you've got to smash the container. So we can see that sheretz is more hectic in terms of what it can infect. So it says, when something's more chilled and it infects something like a zav that affects a mat, isn't it more compelling that a sheretz that was on the mat is definitely going to infect a mat? That's what it's saying.
Can I ask you something quickly? Just
Sure,
sorry.
sure.
How do we know? How come we're using the Kal V'chomer and saying that the mat will be infected and then you can wash it and then at the end of the day it's perfect. The tama goes. But how do we know it doesn't follow the crockery or the pots and pans that have to be chucked away or broken, the earthenware? Sorry. How do we know that the mat doesn't have to be destroyed? As opposed to being washed.
So
because some items are being destroyed and some items being washed. How do we know which cat
No. Okay, let me just clear up 2 points. It's an excellent question. Is that the only time that articles generally get destroyed is if are you talking about sheretz tumah or corpse tumah?
No, sheretz. No. On the subject we're doing right now, yeah, sheretz.
Okay, so it's a bit of a difficult thing. The reason why an oven or stove has to be smashed is because you don't know where you can't access where the sheretz has infected things and how many creatures are in there and where it's fallen, etc. So there's no ways to keep it clean. But any article that you can examine relatively clearly, all it says, and it says this in Leviticus chapter 32, and anything on which any of them falls when dead shall be unclean, be it an article of wood, a cloth, a skin, a sack, any such article that can be put to use by dipping it into water shall remain unclean until evening. So in other words, if you can toivel it, you're fine. You can't toivel an oven.
No, but it also said oven, I agree. But what about earthenware? It said earthenware as well. So earthenware is like crockery. I mean, that if that's got a lid and it's open, not even it doesn't even have to be open. If it's just touched, it has to be thrown away.
So no, that's if part of the sheretz is actually in the container. Earthenware for some reason seems to absorb the container. Does that make sense? But we're getting off the topic here because we need to just develop the Gezerah Shava and the thing.
All right. Okay, carry on. I just wanted to know how do we know it's not thrown away as opposed to just washed?
Yeah, but even if it is thrown away, where it says you shall smash it, it's not going to take away from the Kol V'chomer. It's going to improve the Kol V'chomer. Because this is what the Kol V'chomer is saying, is that zav can't infect an earthenware vial with a small lid opening. And a sheretz can, because you need something the size of a lentil to fall in and infect it. And then you smash the earthenware container. So even if that container is smashed or it's fine until evening, the reality is it can't be used. But I know what you're asking. If it's smashed, then how can you make that comparison to a corpse? Because if it's smashed, then you can't use it ever. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying, how do we know the mat? I mean, that's also a good question, what you just said now as well. But I'm saying that how do we know the mat is that it's eligible to be washed, and then you can still use it after nightfall, as opposed to being smashed or destroyed. It can't be smashed, but why? How do we know it shouldn't be destroyed as opposed to being washed? That's all I'm saying. Because there are two options with
I'll
the
tell you
shearing.
what, in Vayikra, in a different verse, chapter 15, verse 12, it says, an earthenware vessel that one with a discharge touches shall be broken, and any wooden implement shall be rinsed with water. So it seems that whether it's a zav, it's sperm, or it's a sheretz, that earthenware container generally has to be broken. The only time it doesn't have to, let me just finish. The only time it doesn't have to be broken is if it's sealed within the tent of a corpse, because it can't be infected with air tumor. Okay, so let's just get back to the topic. Right, so what it's saying is as follows, very clearly, is that a zav is more relaxed than with regards to a container than a sheretz. That's what a buyer is saying. Because if a zav can't get his physically affect the liquid inside an earthenware vial, that earthenware container remains pure, even if he touches the outside. Because if you touch it from the inside, you can't clean it. From what I understand, because you can't get your body part in there, you can't clean it with a sheretz. That's one of the problems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that does.
Yeah,
I think that's a good answer. All right, thank you.
Okay. Whereas it's just something I thought of now, might be wrong. Whereas a mat or cloth or anything else,
yeah, those things are cleanable. Yeah,
you can get access to it. Same thing with the oven. You can't dump it in the water. You can't dump an oven under. So all it's saying is that a sheretz is more hectic because it infects even an earthenware vial with a small opening. So isn't it more? Yeah.
Yeah,
sorry, I just cover from there. So is it not logically compelling that a mat, which becomes impure in the case of a zav, which is meant to be less stringent than a sheretz, becomes impure in the case of contact with a sheretz? So, what we're saying is, listen, a mat which even becomes impure with a zav, it's definitely going to become impure in contact with the sheretz. Okay. So why is he actually trying to bring this thing? That's what we got to ask. Ask. You had a question. What is it?
Yeah, the question is weren't all the earthenware like porous as well, so they absorbed more of the what's the name? Was that nothing to do with it being the porousness of the material?
So the thing of it is, I thought about what you said, but leather and fabric is very porous. It's even more than earthenware container, and yet we can take that to a
but I would say wearing something is a different sort of thing, though.
No, hear what I'm saying here. If you put dye in water, if you put iodine or some dark magenta dye, like mercurochrome, into liquid, and you put in a fabric, and you pulled it out after 5 minutes, it's going to permanently stain. It's not going to do that with the earthenware container. So that is proof that fabric absorbs to the degree that you can't remove something. And yet if you can remove it, and it would be okay to clean it and then leave it until evening, it's proving that there's some other factor of an earthenware container. And the only factor that you think of is that you can't get to it, the inner part of the vial. Because with the sheretz, you can get to it because all you have to do is drop a lentil size part of the sheretz in, which can get into a small opening. But no zav can get a body part into that. And therefore, when part of the sheretz you found in that opening, you can't clean that vessel in any way. We don't know what's still stuck in there. You can't have access. So even if you rinse it and you try and get it out, you don't know if you've got it out. So you have to smash the container.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer.
And that's
I'm not saying that. Sorry, I'm not saying that earthenware containers or certain containers don't have a susceptibility maybe to absorption and heat. Arthur's got a good point when it comes to kashrut. When you're talking about absorption of flavors, like something that's meat or milk, it does matter what the container is made out of.
okay.
So that is the fact. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's just cover a little bit of ground and see what we can do.
Can I ask one more question? If earthenware gets
Sure.
infected in that way, what happens if something has an opening that's big enough, okay, and something gets in? Do you have to smash that as well, or would that prove that obviously because you can't get in and clean it on a small earthenware?
Okay, that's a great question. I honestly don't know. I'm going to try and speak to Rabbi Cohen a bit just now anyway,
Okay.
because him and I have a meeting where I've got questions on the DAF that he's going to give me a bit of a one-on-one, very graciously. So it's something worth asking. I do know that if it's big enough where Zav can infect it and that you can clean it properly, and it's almost a big open container like what do you call it, a pot or a vase. I think this is the proof. If you've got an earthenware cholent pot and it's big enough where you can see the inside of it, you can put it in a mikveh and it will be clean until evening. So I think, Arthur, you're completely correct.
Okay.
I think if you've got access to it, it would make sense that it's fine.
Okay.
Because it says, it uses the term that you can purify utensils.
Yeah.
Do you remember at the beginning in Numbers 32, Bamidbar chapter 32, talks about purification of containers.
You pull up Numbers 32, man. You're a genius.
So,
Well, that's what I was talking about in my WhatsApp messages yesterday.
Yeah.
Let's carry
on. Arthur was okay. I was wrong. It's actually Bamidbar chapter 31, verse 20. Okay.
No, 32 is pretty close.
So I tell you what.
Just a number, David. One number. One number. Bamidbar, yeah.
Yeah, it's a difference between first and second in a race. So I was going to say to you guys, what are we trying to achieve here? This is what a buyer is trying to say. Look, a kol v'chomer is still a logical derivation. You've got a source law, which is something similar, and you're trying to prove another case from that source law. And a dyer comes to say, listen, let's not get too hectic here. Let's kind of have some restraint. But there's something more powerful than a kol v'chomer, because kol v'chomer is just logic. And that is scriptural sourcing. So what happens is you've got a Gezeirus Shava and a Hekesh. Does everybody know what a Gezeirus Shava is versus Hekesh?
No, please,
I don't really know. I heard the word, I don't really know.
Please, can you give us a proper explanation?
Hekesh or Hekdesh, Damon?
No, Hekdesh is consecrated
to the temple. Hekesh. Okay, no, don't.
Hekesh.
Can't remember.
So you've got what you call hermeneutic principles. There's 13 hermeneutic principles, okay? And think of aeronautics, hermeneutics. I don't know where they get the word hermeneutics from, but that's where it was. So basically, it's Gezeirus Shava is the second rule of Hillel and Rabbi Ishmael.
Okay.
And it's the seventh law of Eliezer ben Yosef HaGlili. Okay? That's the law of the Gezeirus Shava. So what it is if you've got superfluous information in the Parsha, we learn that there's nothing superfluous. So when it uses extra words, the Torah doesn't waste any words at all. Those words have got deeper meanings in other applications. So what you do is you take two juxtaposed verses where a line of wording appears it's not like the word the in the. It has to be something that is quite rare to find. So what it means there is if it uses the word and purification of leather until evening, and you see that in two different parts of the Torah, there's obviously a link between those two different passages. Does that make sense? There can be a link because the sentence structure has got superfluous words that they share in both contexts. It's like what you call a hermeneutic code. So Gezerah Shavah comes to teach us lessons from juxtaposing some of those common, unusual words between two different parshas. That's a Gezerah Shavah. Now, there's something called a double Gezerah Shavah and a one-sided Gezerah Shavah. So a dual Gezerah Shavah.
No, I'm trying to work out my volume's not that loud, so I'm trying to figure out why.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Do you want to?
It's normally louder. I don't know why. I'm going to try plugging in
Okay, so
there you go.
yeah, try and plug it in if you want.
My headphones on because I'm trying to get the information and there's a bit of noise behind me here. I'm going to plug in my headphone rather. Maybe it'll be better for me. Talk now.
How's it? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
All right. So what it is basically a juxtaposition of sections. So you've got two different legal sections, and when you've got certain words that are so unusual that they appear in two different parts of the Torah, and that is a Gezerah Shavah. So there's something known as a weak Gezerah Shavah and a strong Gezerah Shavah. Kev, are you falling asleep?
No.
Okay, no, because this is important. So a strong Gezerah Shavah is what you call a double Gezerah Shavah. What does that mean? Is that both verses don't need those words. Those words are superfluous. So, for example, if I say to you, in the first pasuk, in a random location, for example, like Shmot, there are some very unusual words. But those words are needed to expound and explain that particular concept of the parsha. That's known as a locked Gezerah Shavah. What do we mean locked? It's that because those words are unavailable to really be without it in the context to explain that concept, it's locked. Meaning that if similar words appear somewhere else and those words are the same, we can make a Gezerah Shavah link between the two different parts in the Chumash, but on the side where that Gezerah Shavah is free, what do I mean free? It means those words are not needed to explain the concept. Then if it's locked on one side and free on another, it basically means that it is open to logical criticism, that Gezerah Shavah. In other words, you can use logical refutations for that Gezerah Shavah because it's known as a weak Gezerah Shavah. So a weak Gezerah Shavah is known as when you need that information of common words that are unusual in both different source contexts because you wouldn't understand the parsha without it. Meaning those words are necessary. So they're not fully released words. In other words, you can use them to kind of come to another conclusion about what these two passages have in common, but you can refute it with logical arguments. It's not foolproof. But when you have what you call a impervious Gezerah Shavah, meaning it's strong, that both sides, the wording is unnecessary, that's what you call a completely protected Gezerah Shavah, meaning that it's got these extra words, and without those extra words, you'd know exactly what's going on in that one part of the parsha. You go to a different parsha completely, where it shares those exact words, and those words are not needed in the second part of a different parsha to explain the concept, where the concept is understood completely. We then understand that those two sets of words can be paired together, and a certain halachic rule can be given based on that can't be refuted by logic, because you can't use a logical term, but you're trying to take the words from here, but it's needed at its source in order to explain the parsha. Therefore, it's what you call a non-free Gezerah Shavah, at least on one side. So the more free those extraneous words are, the more that those words can be used for application of law. Does everybody understand?
Not as opposed to the superfluous words.
No. The goal is that it should be superfluous words. Because what I'm saying is, in either side of the parsha, if those words are needed So what is a Gezerah Shava? There's 4 steps to a Gezerah Shava. Step number 1. So step number 1 of a Gezerah Shava is that you're looking at the whole Torah and you're saying, listen, it's got some very unusual concepts of a pattern, maybe of 4 or 5 words in one context of the Torah. In many books later, in a different parsha, it mentions the exact same words in the same order. There's definitely a certain Kabbalistic principle or a certain link of halacha that we can make between the 2 concepts. That's a Gezerah Shava from 2 different parts of the Torah, because the statistical probability of having a set of 4 or 5 words repeated are quite low. So we can deduce something from there. Now, what we can deduce is dependent on how free those words are. In other words, in either of those sources of which you need 2 verses to have a Gezerah Shava, because the first verse has the set of 4 or 5 words exactly in order, and the second part of the parsha in a different place completely, it's got the exact same words. So you need 2 different parsha sources for that. Fine. Once you've got those 2 sources of parsha, you then see the extraneous words and see if you can make a link between both those parshas. And there's definitely a link. Now, the degree at how strong that Gezerah Shava is, in other words, can you apply it to where we follow halachic law based on it, or whether or not it just teaches us a nice Kabbalistic idea, depends on how necessary those words are in terms of the context of each of those parshas. Okay. So, the principle is as follows. The more free it is, the more those words are available, and the stronger your Gezerah Shava. And the stronger your Gezerah Shava, the more likely it will be to use an application of halacha and law. But if those extra words are needed by either part of the parsha, whether we choose the first source or the second, to explain that part of the parsha, in other words, those extra words, if you remove them, are an integral part of the parsha that wouldn't make sense, then that is not called free wording. So even though you might learn a concept from that Gezerah Shava, if it's not free on both sides, meaning those words are extraneous and you still understand the full understanding of that parsha on its literal level, if those words are free, it means it's coming to teach you halacha or something very serious. If those words are not free, where they needed to explain either the parsha of the first source or the second source, and without them, you can't have clarity on what the parsha means on the literal level, it's only free on one side. So, in other words, it can either be free on either side, which means that your Gezerah Shava is weak and you can deduce maybe a concept or 2, but nothing that can't be logically refuted. And the halakha there wouldn't really be applied. It would be far less strong. Whereas if the words are unnecessary, just give me a second, if the words are unnecessary, and they would still, each parsha would make complete sense, it means those words are free, and it means it's a much stronger Gezerah Shava. So the strongest Gezerah Shava is when those extra additional words are free in both sources, and when those words come together and you take the 2 parshas and you link it at those contexts, you can actually come up with something as strong as halacha, which cannot be logically refuted.
Damon?
I think if you saw, sorry, Martin.
I don't know if it's just me, but what do you
saw
mean
an
by
example
free?
of that.
Sorry, go for it, whatever. Go,
I think what Damon, and let me try explain what, tell me if I'm wrong, Damon.
Yes.
It means if it's specific to that parasha and a specific concept, it can't be applied anywhere else, then it's not free.
I don't understand about the free thing. I'm totally confused by the free thing. The free
I think
word,
he must show us an example. I think it would be better, Damon.
Can I give a shot? Can I give a shot? I think I understand it.
Okay.
Because it might help other people if I'm right. I don't know if I'm right. But my understanding is if those so-called extra words are relevant to that particular parsha where it's in, if it's required in order to make sense, literally, then they're not really free words. So if they connect to another parsha where it has free words, then it's weaker because it's only free on the one side. It's not free on both sides. Am I right, Damon?
And I'm confused totally.
Okay, just let me see if I understand.
No, I sort of know what Gavin's saying. Yeah.
Just give Gavin a chance, guys. Say it again. I'm listening to every word.
Just see if I'm not sure if I'm right. I'm not. This is quite a hard concept. So I heard everything you said. I just want to see if I understand it. So my understanding is that you need to have, in order to get the maximum out of Gevera Shava, you need to have 3 words in the. Let's say you got 2 parshas that you trying to create a Gevera Shava from. So they could be different books, different parshas, whatever. So you take the two, you take the extra words in the first parsha, but they're not actually extra words. They're actually necessary and required in order to make sense literally in the first parsha. In the second parsha, you've got these 3 extra words. So it's on the one side, so it's a bit weaker because it's not free on both sides. So on that second side, you can extrapolate some sort of law, but if it's not logical, then you can't really apply it because it's not super strong. It's only super strong if those additional words are not necessary in the first parsha or the second parsha to make literal sense in the meaning. So if the literal sense it can be extrapolated without using those additional words on both sides, then you've got a strong Gevera Shava because the words on both sides are free; they're not being utilized. Then you have a super strong Gevera Shava, and you can derive halacha and law from that, and logic doesn't apply. And then you can have a scenario where the words aren't free on both sides, and that makes it even weaker, where they're necessary in both parshas. I'm not even sure if you can do a Gevera Shava. Can you do a Gevera Shava in that particular case where the words are necessary for the literal meaning on both sides?
11 a.m. You can, but what it will do is it will give you a nice understanding of depth and a nice Kabbalistic concept or something like that, but nothing that you could not logically refute or apply law to necessarily.
So it's very weak. It's very weak, yeah.
Gavin, I want your NZT.
Ba?
That's why he can take the show.
You obviously haven't watched Limitless.
All I can tell you is if I took it, I would be as smart as you.
So listen, you're a lot.
Okay, I'm confused here.
I think, Damon, if we set an example,
the free words, I don't say to my free words.
If we just set an example to understand it, that would be easier, I think.
Yeah.
So Gavin said it perfectly. His NZT drug and Limitless, we need some. So I'm going to use some simple examples and just break it up into a few easy steps. So what happened is, how did this Gezerah, Shava, and Hekesh issue come up? Because Gavin on his drugs last night, yesterday afternoon, found a problem. Firstly, we had a case of a Zav, which anything he touches is impure until evening. Anything he touches and carries. A human corpse by air tumor, by air contamination, affects things for 7 days. So now that we're having a problem that we can't explain why there's no diode, there's no limited application on the mat where it's only impure until evening and it's impure until 7 days, we're saying obviously there was clearly no limitation placed on the Kol V'chomer, which leaves us with a problem. So there was an answer given by a buyer, which Ravina answered to Achav Difti. He said a buyer had a particular answer. He amended it and he said there's a Gezerah Shava, and he hasn't mentioned the word Gezerah Shava yet. It's coming up. He said, listen, we're using an example of a sheret. So this is how the Kol V'chomer goes. Listen, a Zav doesn't make vessels impure because he can't get into the open vial. It's too small. Okay. And yet a sheret, because it's only a lentil piece that can make the whole container impure to the degree you have to smash it, we can see a sheret is much more hectic. Okay. So if even a Zav can make a mat impure by lying on it, surely a sheret will make that mat impure by lying on it. And therefore, if we use an example of a sheret for this Kol V'chomer of a corpse, of air contamination, it's going to be stronger. But the problem that comes up is a sheret still is impure until evening. That's the problem. So it seems no more stringent than a Zav. So how does that sort out this problem of the 7 days? for the human corpse, because there's still no daya that seems to apply to the Kol V'chomer, even if you use the Sheretz as an example. It might be more, in certain ways, hectic than a Zav, but in some ways it's not more hectic than a Zav. Look, what is agreed is that they're both only impure until evening, once you clean your clothes. But I can tell you something, that a Zav infects by touching and carrying, whereas a Sheretz just infects by touching. So in that way, even a Zav is stronger. So it hasn't proven anything. So the reason I'm explaining to you about this Gezerah Shava is that obviously have a Gezerah Shava. A buyer has a Gezerah Shava with regards to Sheretz. So a Gezerah Shava means that you don't have to do what you do in a Kol V'chomer and use the extrapolated principle from a target, from a source, and apply to the target. Meaning that you can still keep the 7 days of Tumah for a mat, even if you're taking it from a Sheretz, providing the comparison made with the Sheretz is not your own logic of the Kol V'chomer, but based on scriptural Gezerah Shavas or Hekesh, because it's based on different principles, and those principles have different rules. Nobody says with the Gezerah Shava, the source of your target, the source area has to be the same as the target area. It can be the source of a different verse that shares that common verse be your target area in a different case. So all I'm saying, bottom line, is if you use it with the Gezerah Shava or Hekesh, then you can prove it without a need for a daya, because Kol V'chomer is just logic. So we always restrain logic, but if you've got scriptural Gezerah Shavas, it's stronger. You can then say that a mat will keep the impurity of 7 days for air contamination, because you don't have to use the. In other words, if we use Sheretz and we use the Kol V'chomer from Sheretz alone, without a Gezerah Shava, it's no stronger than the Zav. And why don't we use a Zav with a Gezerah Shava? Can anybody tell me why we don't use a Gezerah Shava from a Zav?
Presume we don't have superfluous words.
Correct. There is no Gezerah Shava with the Zav. There aren't words that are in common with the human corpse. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So how it works is as follows. I think, let me just explain it to you from Rashi. This would help. So basically, in Gemara Nida 22b, it explains how a Gezerah Shava works. It's immune to logical refutation only if the common expression upon which the Gezerah Shava is based is not needed to teach any other law. In other words, it's free or available for interpretation because it's not needed for the plain sense of the verse of the passage. Okay? Otherwise, the Gezerah Shava is valid only as long as there is no logical reason to differentiate between the subjects linked by common expression. So what it's saying, Arthur, is as follows.
Yeah.
That you can argue with the Gezerah Shava based on logic if that Gezerah Shava, the wording there, is essential for explaining the clear verse meaning of the pasuk. In other words, what happens is on one side of the pasuk, from, say, for example, Bamidbar, you've got certain common words, 4 or 5 words in common. And then you've got the same thing in Shmot. And I turn around and I say these two are linked, right?
Yeah.
And therefore we want to apply the law like this. You can say, but Damon, you might be able to learn a nice idea because there's definitely some commonality. But those words are not free to apply your halacha because they needed to explain the plain sense of the verse. The more free those words are, the more they're free for a completely different context of applying something as strong as law. Now, if it's free on both ends, what do we mean on both ends? We mean on the first side of the verse, you could understand the verse without those extra words. And on the second verse, in a different part of the book, those words are free to explain that other part of the verse. And now you've got these two sets of words that are exactly in common, but they're free. They're not needed to explain the plain sense of the verse. That's the strongest Gezerah Shava you have that's free on both sides, which means it's coming to teach you a principle at which you can apply halacha, And your logic can't argue with it, because your logical argument could say, but you're just taking those words. Those words are actually needed to literally explain the parsha. And my refutation to your logic there would say the parsha makes perfect sense without those words. So the words are not needed there. They're not held prisoner or captive by the parsha. Therefore, they're free to teach us something specific. So the more free they are, because it's free on both sides, on neither side and on one side. Not free on either side, meaning that each verse that you quote needs those extra words to explain the clarity of the respective parshas. When the words are not needed in one case and you understand the meaning of the parsha, but the same words are needed in another case because the parsha doesn't make sense without it, it's only free on one side. So being only free on one side, there is an opinion that says it's not subject to logical refutation, and another opinion that says it is subject to logical refutation. But every source agrees that if it's free on both sides, meaning those extra words are not needed to explain either of those verses, all of the sages agree that you cannot logically refute the Gezerah Shava, and it would even apply to an application of halacha.
Can I just ask you a very simple question? Sorry. Just those words that are free on both sides, do they have to be absolutely identical, word for word?
Yeah. Good
Okay,
question.
so that's a great question. Now, the more words that are free in common, the less the statistical probability of it being an accident. So if you words the word like the cat, that's not really a Gezerah Shava. It's too vague. When you have a word saying purification of leather and fabric, it's such an odd term that to see that twice exactly in that order is quite strong. I'm coming to you now, Kev. So okay. I'm going to say the more peculiar the likelihood of the set of words in the right order being repeated, the stronger the Gezerah Shava is.
Yeah, so that's actually another thing. Are they the same words and are they in the same order? That's an additional, thank you.
They have to be correct. What was, Arthur, do you understand the concept now?
Not in the vaguest thing.
I think he needs an example.
I'm still struggling on the word free word. I don't understand what free word means. I mean, you understand the concept around it. I don't understand what free word means. I mean, if you give me, I don't understand it.
Example, yeah.
No, I know what you're saying. Example, because I can give you an example. What Arthur has to understand is the concept, not the example. Okay.
So what does free word mean?
Okay, what it means is that if I give you a set of instructions and I say, I want you to understand a particular concept.
Okay.
And there are words in that concept that without those words, you wouldn't understand what it is you're doing. It's like an instruction manual. If there was if there were some steps added that were, if they were missing, you wouldn't understand what the hell's going on. That's not free. Those words are needed. Each and every word of the Torah is not wasted. So if those words are needed to explain the literal meaning of the parsha, that's not free. In other words, because you needed to explain the parsha that you are. What do you not get?
I don't get the free word. I mean, you explain.
I think he needs an example. I think that'll be easier for him, Damon.
It won't, Kev. The reason won't help an example. If I say fabric and leather to be immersed until evening, it's not gonna. If I show you two verses where it's in, it's not gonna help Arthur have any more clarity. Arthur, this is caused by two reasons.
Okay.
No, you never did prep because your brain works in a genius way, but you have to read something on your own first to let it absorb. And when you don't do the prep, you in particular battle because that's your learning style.
It's not that I understand what you're trying to say, but when you say a free word, I don't understand how you're explaining it to me.
Superfluous word, I think, Damon.
No, because you said there's no superfluous words.
I'm using the word free instead of superfluous because I'm trying not to use complicated language.
Oh, okay. So basically no extra words. Okay, yeah.
So what I'm saying is if we say, let's say, Kevin, superfluous words. If those extra words are superfluous, which means they just like poetically explaining the point. But you
Okay.
could understand the parsha without that extra fluffy words.
Oh,
What's
okay.
wasted.
Okay.
If there's extra words and they appear,
Yeah.
they appear not wasted, but they appear not essential to understanding the concept of what you're learning. They're nice.
Okay.
They're nice additions, but they're not essential. Without them, you can still understand what's going on. If you can still understand what's going on without those nice words, those words are meant there specifically for another reason. And
Okay.
those reasons are to teach you a secret hidden halacha.
Okay.
For
Now
the
I
Gazelle.
understand it, Damon.
David
Three
explained it
words.
very well. Yeah, also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't
understood
catch
it
it when you
earlier,
said
but
free
no.
words at first. I don't know what you're talking. I thought what these are like words are lying around
that's good.
somewhere and they're free. You can pay for them or discounted. Now I understand. Okay, now I understand. So basically, it's the words that actually create the extra atmosphere that's not needed.
Yes, if they're needed, and without them, you can't understand literally what you're reading in the Parsha. And I want to bring a example of these unique words in this Parsha with another Parsha and say, I've come up with an idea. You can say, listen, it's actually a very interesting idea, but it makes sense. But we can't base halacha on that idea because those words are not available purely for your Gezerah Shabbat.
Okay.
Because if they're pulled out of the Parsha and the Parsha doesn't make sense, it's not strong enough to base halacha law on it. It's enough to get a nice idea out of it, but not enough to base law.
Okay.
But when they are available to be used in a completely different context, and that parsha will make exact sense. In that particular case, they were put there for hidden purposes, because the Torah was not written just on one level. It was written on multiple levels. And you can't turn around and say, but the great sages can't apply a halacha there because those words are needed, because those words are not needed, they're extra. That's why it can overthrow a logical argument, because those words were not needed. But there's a stronger Gezerah Shabbat. So if they needed in one context, in your first part of the Parsha, but they're not needed on the second, that there are some rabbis that say you can determine halacha from that, because it's free or available, those extra words on one parsha, but not on another. And then the other rabbis that say that it's simply not good enough, and you can logically refute it, because you can refute it on the grounds of saying on this one parsha you need the words. So it's not strong enough necessarily for halacha. But when it's free on both sources, where you've got these special sets of words and the parsha still makes sense, and you're taking two different parshas with these extra set of words, and you can pull them out of each parsha and join them, and the parshas respectively still make sense, that is strong enough to base Jewish law on it.
Okay. So I think I'm getting. I have to go through it one more time, but I sort of understand a lot better. It was just confusing about the free words. That's the whole thing it was. But
Good. But does it make more sense now?
yeah, a lot. What I want to do is I want to watch this recording again, and just listen a few times from the explanation you gave me now, after the second time, and just go through like 2-3 times just to get it like down solid.
Okay. So I just want to explain the word hekesh, and then we'll finish now.
Then I want to make a comment after that, Damon.
Yeah, sure. So a hekesh is so a Gezerah Shabbat is shared words, specifically the words from two completely separate books or parshas or whatever. But they're so unusual, the words, that there is an exact match. The more unusual the words, obviously in the exact right order, is too spooky to be a coincidence. So there's something called a hekesh. A hekesh is when one paragraph leads on to another. So the perfect example is Shabbos. If I say to you, please honor the Sabbath and remember it and keep it holy, and we need to apply those rules, you're going to say, but what do we need to do? So those rules about Shabbos are placed in the Parsha where we're told to keep Shabbos after the instructions are given about building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. So there are 39 categories of activities that were used in building the Mishkan, including carrying from a private to a public domain and a public to a private. So we can understand from a Hikesh that the laws of Sabbath, of what to refrain from in terms of human activity, are directly from the source of building the tabernacle, because that is a Hikesh. It comes straight after. The question of how we observe Shabbos comes straight after or straight before the laws of the Mishkan. So they're so juxtaposed next to each other that they don't have to have common words. It's the one runs into the other. As you read in the Parsha, it explains itself.
Okay.
Can
So
you just
that's
explain that
what it
again?
is.
Sorry, I lost a bit of concentration, I'll be honest. Sorry.
Okay.
No,
So
it's
Gavin,
my-
a Hekesh is when you're reading a book. Say you're reading a novel or a story or whatever, okay? And you're reading a story on like The Godfather, and in the one scene it says, we make him an offer he can't refuse, okay? And the next thing, because they're trying to get Frank Sinatra out of his contract and into being allowed into a movie contract, and Frank Sinatra, they don't want him in there. So the mafia says to him, listen, we're going to go to this movie producer and say, wish him an offer he can't refuse. So that's your first scene in the movie. The second scene is the guy wakes up and he's got his beloved horse, and he wakes up and there's blood all over. And the first thing he checks is that he hasn't been castrated or killed or whatever. He's immediately relieved to see that he's intact.
Okay.
And then he rips off his blanket and sees the decapitated head of his favorite dead horse in the bed. And he realizes that the mafia could kill him if they wanted to. And he gets a direct message from this Hekesh that when you're watching the movie, to say that the previous scene, when the mafia don says, we want to give him an offer he can't refuse, that your Hekesh means that you've come to the conclusion that they've made him an offer verbally and said, if you don't allow Frank Sinatra in this plot, in this movie plot, we'll kill you. And the next scene is this intimidation. So Hekesh is a logical extension of the story to understand what takes place. So if it says, well, how do you keep Shabbos? And it talks about then the building of the Mishkan, or it talks about building of the Mishkan and then how to keep Shabbos. You realize that if there are no rules given, that because it's a verse and a paragraph falling directly under, the 39 malachas, categories of work that are required for building a Mishkan, which is also carrying from a private domain to public and public to private, which is prohibited on Shabbos, these are the rules of which we have to refrain on Shabbos.
Okay.
So that's called a Hekesh. In other words, it's not special words, it's logical sequencing. That's the difference. And it's also a hermeneutic principle, same as the Gezerah Shabbat. It's a hermeneutic principle.
So I just want to ask you something, just to see if I've understood it, because I did hear you now. So a Hekesh will always follow sequentially directly afterwards. It's not in a different book. It's in the same page, in fact. Or could be the next page.
It generally carries on. That's right. Generally.
It carries on directly. So in that particular example, which I thought was very good about Shabbos, is that Shabbos follows directly after the Mishkan. And the Mishkan shows you all the 39, malachas. Is that the work that's involved?
Melocha, yeah. Melocha, yeah.
So it shows you the 39 tasks, study tasks that are required in order to build the Mishkan, and all of those are work related. So
Correct.
Because Shabbat follows just after that, we take it that how do we know that the 39 are not applicable, that we can do them on Shabbat? Why is it the reverse?
No, because it says these are you see, because these 39 categories are proving man's mastery over the physical world. And the point in Shabbos is it said, you shall do no work. You shall refrain from.
I understand that. So does it say that? Yeah.
No,
sorry.
Let me finish. It says that, listen, in the desert, they had no work. Hashem provided manna for them of food. Their work was physical activities in order to build the tabernacle. That was the only sort of work they could have had. It wasn't Parnassa based because it was also an agrarian culture in terms of agriculture and chopping and everything else. So what we learn is it was hard work to build the Mishkan. And there were certain categories like plowing and chopping and dyeing and all sorts of things which show man's mastery over the physical world. Because how do we prove this? Is when you bake bread, you take the loaves that they baked in the Mishkan, the loaves that they used as part of the service. Now, how do you take wheat, grind it up, and make bread? It shows man's mastery that he can use fire, he can process raw substances and end up with a finished product. So anything where there's man's mastery over the physical world is what is prohibited on Shabbos. These are the 39 major categories. Within there are subcategories. And the subcategories that would occur today are doing work that would enable you to earn a living, to earn financially.
No, I agree. So does Shabbos just follow afterwards, and we just by implication say that because Shabbos you can't work, therefore the 39 activities that we require for the Mishkan are prohibited on Shabbos? Or does it specifically spell it out and say these 39 malachas are not, you can't do them on Shabbos?
Excellent question. It's made by inference. So what the inference would be about is as follows. It says here, these are the 39 categories of work on how you build the Mishkan. Fine. Here are the 39 categories. Bang, 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 bang. Then you carry on to read and says, on Shabbos, you shall refrain from any category of work.
Okay, that's inference. All right, perfect.
Inference. So, thank you. From there we deduce what's allowed and what's not allowed.
No, perfect. I got it.
Does that make sense? It doesn't say refer to the Mishkan. What you can do in the Mishkan, you can't do it on Shabbos. It's inference. By me saying to you, these are the categories of work within the Mishkan. And the next thing we learn about Shabbos, it says you can do no work on Shabbos. You can take the logical extrapolation. That's a hekesh.